Have you ever trespassed? You're probably thinking of a no trespassing sign somewhere. Maybe you had some event in your past where you actually were trespassing. I will divulge one such story. When I was a teenager, it was my junior year of high school. My high school that I had been going to had shut down after my sophomore year, and the campus sat empty and closed. And during my junior year, a friend and I decided that we wanted to go visit our old high school campus. And there was nobody there, and it was locked for the most part. But there were very clear, evident gaps and holes in the perimeter, and so we let ourselves into one of those holes, and we walked around the campus just sort of taking in, what had felt like at that age. It felt like we hadn't been there for a long time. Of course, it'd only been a year. But so we sort of wandered that campus until the lone security guard who patrolled that campus happened to find us, hollered at us, pointed a flashlight at us, and that was the last we saw of him. So it was one of those dumb, youthful things that you do. But we were there trespassing. Now that's what we tend to think of when we think of trespassing. You think of a no trespassing sign, and you think trespassing is going on somebody else's property where you're not supposed to be. That's our concept of trespassing. In the Bible, though, the concept of a trespass is not that. It's not wandering into somebody's territory, wandering onto somebody's land. It's more equated with sin. And we see sin and trespass talked about a lot. And in fact, there are two very distinct offerings that are talked about in the book of Leviticus that I'd like to go through today. One of them is called the sin offering, and the other is called the trespass offering. The last time I had a chance to speak to you was on atonement, and we went through the burnt offering and some of what that symbolizes, especially its involvement in atonement, in the atonement process. Today, though, I'd like to switch over to what some see as sort of negative offerings. Because when you think about some of the offerings, the burnt offering and the peace offering and the grain offering, those things are called a sweet savor to God. The smell of those is said to be something that He appreciates, that He likes. At least in the Old Testament, that's how it's termed. That He liked the smell of those offerings. The trespass and the sin offering aren't described that way. They're not sweet savor offerings. They're not something that it's said that God loved the aroma of these. These are a different thing. And so I'd like to look at these today. Because again, if we look at the offerings and we read in Hebrews where it talks about Jesus Christ being the fulfillment of those things, that they've been removed in the sense that He fulfilled them once for all, that they pointed to Him. They pointed directly to Him. And the reason that we don't come here every week and have a couple of burnt offerings on the Sabbath is because He did something that fulfilled all of those offerings. And so when we look at the offerings, we have to acknowledge that there's something about these offerings that we can still learn from. Even though we don't burn them today, we don't offer them today, we don't need to offer them today, there's something about them that is instructive. There's something about them that teaches us. So let's turn over to Leviticus chapter 5. I'd like to start with the trespass offerings. And we'll work our way back to Leviticus 4 where we talk about the sin offerings. Now, at the top of chapter 5 in your Bible, it might say the law of guilt offerings or the law of trespass offerings. It's not entirely correct to start it there. It actually doesn't start until verse 14. The beginning of chapter 5 is still talking about the sin offerings. There's a little bit of confusion because of verse 6. Verse 6 makes it sound like it's a trespass offering, but it's actually still just a continued description of the sin offering. I'm not going to go into a real detailed proof of that point. If you want to contend with me on that afterwards, I'm happy to hear it. But it's generally acknowledged that going up through verse 13 of chapter 5 is still actually talking about the sin offering. So we're going to start our discussion of the trespass offering down in verse 14. This is where we start to see something about trespass. And we're going to see that it's something different than sin. Leviticus 5 and verse 14. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if a person acts unfaithfully and sins unintentionally against the Lord's holy things, then he shall bring his guilt offering, or his trespass offering, to the Lord, a ram without defect from the flock, according to your valuation in silver by shekels, in terms of the shekel of the sanctuary, for a guilt offering. He shall make restitution for that which he has sinned against the holy thing, and shall add to it a fifth part of it, and give it to the priest. The priest shall then make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering, and it will be forgiven him. Wow. There's a lot in there. And it's not always, if you read it through like that, it's not always clear entirely what's going on here. But it's actually very interesting. And I hope that you will find it interesting also. Let's start. It says, if a person acts unfaithfully and sins unintentionally against the Lord's holy things, or if a person trespasses, we're going to see that trespass, in every case, a trespass involves wrong being done to someone else, injury to another person, or to God. A trespass has to do with an action that is done by you or me that hurts someone else, or that hurts God, that's injurious somehow. From the book The Law of the Offerings by Andrew Jukes, he sums it up this way. He says, in every case of trespass, wrong was done. There was an act of evil by which another was injured. And the offering for this act was offered by the offerer not because he was, but because he had done evil. So it has to do with actions. It has to do with something that was performed, something that was done against somebody else. Notice that it says, and sins unintentionally. A lot of translations say unintentionally. Yours might say unintentionally. But that's not entirely the meaning in English. Turn over a page to chapter 6. Chapter 6 and verse 2. This is still talking about the trespass offering. And we're talking about sins that are done, as it says there, unintentionally. Chapter 6 and verse 2. When a person sins and acts unfaithfully against the Lord and deceives his companion in regard to a deposit or a security entrusted to him, or through robbery. Now, have you unintentionally robbed someone before? Or have you unintentionally extorted from someone before? These are things that are generally done knowingly. This isn't like, oh, oops, I accidentally extorted money from my employer. These aren't unintentional. The sense of these is actually more to go astray, to error, to make a mistake. That's the class of sin that it's talking about here. It's not talking about defiant sins that are done defiantly in the face of God. The Old Testament doesn't actually give any indicator that there was ever a sacrifice or a way to be redeemed from those. Defiant sins actually got you cut off from the congregation and cast out. So this is talking about sins, again, where you see in here where it says unintentional. Don't think unintentional in the modern English sense. Think it's more of a go astray. The word even means to wander or to stagger. It's sort of something done in weakness. Something that, like you or I do. We do things in weakness, in error. We go astray. And we'll see verses later that talk about this same idea. Back in Leviticus 5, in verse 15. So if a person acts unfaithfully and sins unintentionally or errors or goes astray against the Lord's holy things, then he shall bring his guilt offering to the Lord, a ram without defect from the flock. So there is an offering made. Here a ram. A ram is brought, and the ram is brought before God, and the offering is made. Now, there's something in addition to this too. According to your valuation in silver by shekels, in terms of the shekel of the sanctuary for a guilt offering, he shall make restitution for that which he sinned against in the holy thing, and shall add to it a fifth part of it and give it to the priest. So in addition to an offering being brought, there was a payment brought. So let's say you had extorted money from your employer, right? Or you had robbed someone. Now, if you were bringing an offering to cover this sin, to cover this offense, then you would also need to bring whatever you had robbed, or the value of it, plus 20% on top of it. Right? That was a part of this offering. There was the offering itself that was offered and given up, and then there was the payment that was made. There was recompense for it. This is not something that we see in the other offerings. This is to make up again. So this is when an injury was done to someone else or to God. Then there was a value assigned to what that cost, and then the person had to bring that plus 20% on top of it to make up for what had been done. And it says, then the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering, and it will be forgiven him. So we see that there were two purposes for this offering: forgiveness and atonement. And we see those are very separate things. Forgiveness, right, is the blotting out of the sin. If there's sin that's performed, there's something that's done that's wrong, that injures another person, justice demands that there's something required of you, right? But this was, in the Old Testament anyway, this was for the purifying of the flesh, is the way that Hebrews talks about it. It wasn't actually the taking away of sins. This is what Jesus Christ's sacrifice has done in the larger sense, in the fulfilling of these sacrifices. Hebrews talks about how the blood of bulls and goats could never forgive sins. But we know Jesus Christ's sacrifice does forgive sins. He fulfilled these sacrifices and made them even bigger, even more meaningful, even more powerful. But when you or I sin, when we do something against someone else, there's a requirement of justice. And the penalty for that is death. And this required then the symbolic death of the sinner. So the sinner would come, in the case of the trespass offering, and lay their hands on the offering. This symbols transference, right? Your guilt onto the guilt of the offering. Right? The same way that our guilt, when we trespass, is transferred to Jesus Christ. It's not just, it doesn't just sort of disappear. It's transferred to Him as the offering that was given, that was made. And then there can be forgiveness of that sin, because God's sense of justice has been satisfied. Right? Sin requires death. And in the Old Testament case, sin required the death of the thing sacrificed. In our case, Jesus Christ died, and that covers that sin. But that alone doesn't make up for the injury that was done. That doesn't cover it. If you rob from somebody, you can't rob somebody of $1 million and then come and bring your ram and say, "Well, here's my ram, and I'm covered now, and I've got a nice reserve in the bank." No, there's more, right? Because the injury was done. Atonement is about the restoration of relationships. So on top of the forgiveness that's required, right, that comes through the sacrifice, there's atonement. And so, again, that's why there's the compensation. There was the money that was paid. There was the thing There was restitution above and beyond, 20% over, right? And that helps with atonement. Now, if I've robbed you of some amount of money, and I do whatever I do, in the Old Testament case, you go and you offer your ram, and then you come to the person and say, I stole this from you, I'm sorry, plus 20%. That does something to help restore the relationship there, right? And more importantly, there's restoration, there's atonement with God. You can have that relationship restored, because certainly you can't be at one with God if you are at odds with all of your brethren. So atonement is a very big part of this. In the remainder of chapter 5 and the beginning of chapter 6, we see specific things outlined about the trespass offering. And we're not going to go into all of them, but suffice it to say that what we see about these offerings is that God's word is the standard, and that there is guilt that is attributed to someone who trespasses, whether we know it or not, right? Whether we understand that we've trespassed or not, right? When we do something that's contrary to God's way, guilt is assigned. Right? Guilt isn't a feeling. Guilt is a condition. Guilt is something where we can, whether we know it or not, we can look and say, you know what, I am guilty of such and such. And we understand that perhaps we have trespassed against God or against another human being. But God in the Old Testament created these conditions for people to begin to fix that situation. Jesus Christ is the trespass offering, the fulfillment of it. We see this. Let's turn over to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 and verse 4. It says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken and smitten by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. So that speaks to the forgiveness side of this, right? Guilt was transferred from us to Jesus Christ. And so we can have forgiveness. He was wounded for our transgressions, our trespasses. Our sin is then blotted out. He bore them, it says. He's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was bruised for our iniquities, and the chastisement for our peace was upon him. And then it says, by his stripes we are healed. This is quoted again in the New Testament, that by his stripes we are healed, that we were going one direction, but now we have returned to the shepherd of our souls. This is atonement, right? This is the restoration of relationships. By his stripes we're healed. We can have oneness with God. We can have oneness with each other, right? This is the healing and the restoration that we have in Jesus Christ. That's his fulfillment of this sacrifice. So it's a very powerful sacrifice. It's a very powerful offering. Drop down to verse 10. You'll notice, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. This is talking about God the Father. It pleased God the Father to bruise him, capital H, Jesus Christ. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. We see in this that Jesus Christ, right, in Jesus Christ, God the Father, right, who is the offended party, he's the one that sin is against. When we sin, it's ultimately against God because it's against his commandments, it's against his laws. So when we sin, God is the offended party, but here we get the sense that he is satisfied and that he's received more than the wrong that was done to him. Right? The sin that was done to him, the injury that was done to him to his way. He has Jesus Christ as a trespass offering. And it says that he is satisfied. So you get the sense there that he's received that 20% above and beyond. He's received restitution in Jesus Christ for the trespasses against him. That's the trespass offering. I want to move back now to the sin offering. Let's go to Leviticus 4. Now, if you fell asleep for all of that, the main takeaway is that the trespass offering is for things done, actions. Things that are done against God, things that are done against another individual. It's the actions. Sin offering is something entirely different. Let's go to Leviticus 4 and verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally," again, all the caveats around unintentionally that we discussed earlier. "But if a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done and commits any of them," and then starting in verse 3, it's going to get into different conditions for the sin offering. That's the lead up. So all we get as far as background to the sin offering is that if a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded. If you look at the trespass offerings, if you go into chapter 6 and you start reading again, right? We talked about extortion, we talked about robbery, we talked about, all of these specific things are enumerated. These things that are done against somebody else. The actions that are done against somebody else. Here, in the sin offering, we don't see those actions enumerated. It's not about the things that are done so much. That's not really the focus. What we start seeing is regulations for specific people or specific groups of people. So we see generally here the lead up is if a person sins against any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, then in verse 3 it tells us what the anointed priest is supposed to do. In verse 13 it tells us if the whole congregation has sinned, here's what they're supposed to do. In verse 22 it says if a ruler among you has sinned, here's what the ruler is supposed to do. And in verse 27 it says if a commoner, one of the common people, sins, here's what they're supposed to do. The focus in the sin offering is not on the thing done, it's on the person. It's on the individual. Or in the case of the congregation, it's on the group. It's not about the sin, it's about the person. It's getting down to something a little more core than just our actions. It's getting down to our nature. Let's go ahead and read let's pick it back up in verse 3. If the anointed priest sins so as to bring guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord a bull without defect as a sin offering for the sin he has committed. He shall bring the bull to the doorway of the tent of meeting before the Lord, and he shall lay his hand on the head of the bull and slay the bull before the Lord. Again, laying the hands on the head of the offering symbolizes transfer of guilt. It symbolizes that the bull is then standing in place of the person doing the offering. The bull then symbolizes Jesus Christ. It symbolizes him bearing that in our place. And so sin is transferred. Then the anointed priest is to take, verse 5, the anointed priest is to take some of the blood of the bull and bring it to the tent of meeting, and the priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary. So this is in front of the veil of the holy place, where the blood is sprinkled. It's almost as though it's sort of a reminder that area is unapproachable without sacrifice, without Jesus Christ's sacrifice. That holy place inside the tabernacle symbolized God's throne in heaven. It was unapproachable. They couldn't approach it without the blood of the sacrifice. And so, similarly, we know we have no access to God. We would have absolutely no contact with him. We wouldn't be able to pray to him. He wouldn't hear anything we say without Jesus Christ's sacrifice. Without that sacrifice in place, it's unapproachable. And so he sprinkles some of the blood 7 times before the Lord. Verse 7, the priest shall also put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense, which is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. And all the blood of the bull he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Those are 2 separate altars. One altar was a very holy altar, a golden altar for offering incense. The other altar was a much larger altar, which is where they offered the burnt offerings every day. Bulls. It's a big altar, right? They had to put animals on this, large animals on this all the time. And so they had to go and sanctify the altars. They had to go sanctify the sanctuary and the altars again before they could offer anything. It's just this reminder that they couldn't really approach God until blood had covered that sin that was performed. Now, if you read through, you'll see that there are a few different varieties of this offering, and that it's different for whoever is doing the offering, right? For the priest would offer a young bull, right? And if you read about the congregation, if the congregation sinned, then a young bull again would be offered. If it was a ruler of the people, then it was a kid of the goats, a male kid of the goats. If it was a common person, it was a female kid of the goats. So we see these 4 different things being offered depending on the variety. It's also interesting in that if you look at what was performed, we're not going to go in detail in all of this. I just want to sort of pique your interest, because I think that there's a lot in this topic and in this material that is worth pursuing that we don't always necessarily pursue, again, because we know the offerings are fulfilled. But again, there's so much we can learn. If you look at this offering, the sin offering, you'll see that blood was sprinkled before the holy place 7 times in the case of the priest sinning or the congregation sinning. In the case of an individual, whether that was a ruler or whether that was a commoner among the people, there's no talk of the blood being sprinkled. It was very different. For that same reason, the offering for the priest or for the congregation, which was a bull, a much bigger animal, that was taken outside of the camp. It was taken outside of the camp to a clean place, and it was burned completely on the ground. The whole thing, symbolizing Jesus Christ. We know he was taken out of the camp, and again, Hebrews, we read earlier, very specifically says that was typical of Jesus Christ. He did that. He was taken outside of the camp and killed. In the case of the smaller offerings, the lesser offerings, if you want to say, whether that was for the ruler or for a commoner, those offerings were actually eaten by the priests. It was something that the priest consumed. So you have these different things that happen depending on who was giving the offering. Anyway, you'll have to look into that and study that if you're more interested. But we see that there were common things that were done with the offering as well, and that there were also accommodations made for people that couldn't afford to bring a goat. If a commoner couldn't afford to bring a goat as a sin offering, then they could bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And if they couldn't do that, then they could bring a grain offering. They could even offer grain for a sin offering, which is interesting when you think about it. Right? It wasn't a life offered. It was grain that was offered. It was fine flour. And there's symbolism in that flour as well. But what I really want to get at is the difference between sin, this sin offering and what it symbolizes, and the trespass offering. Remember, trespass implies action, what you do, right? Especially against somebody else. Sin implies your nature. It implies what you are. The sin offering got to the core of what you and I are as individuals. Not what we do, Our actions are the fruit of something. God talks about the fruit of His Spirit, and it talks about the fruit of, this carnal nature that we have, the works of the flesh. Right? Our trespasses are the fruit of that nature. The sin offering just went right to the core of that nature and what we are. And in the sin offerings, the focus, if you read through these, the focus is not on the sin committed. If you look over at the beginning of chapter 5, you'll see a list of things that are examples of sins that might warrant a sin offering. And it sort of enumerates some things. If a person sins after he hears a public adjuration to testify when he is a witness, and he does not tell it, then he'll bear his guilt. Or if he touches any unclean thing. Again, you'll notice in that list that these aren't things that are done against somebody else either. But the focus of the sin offering is not those things so much. It's what we are at our nature. Turn over to Romans 7. We were there earlier. Let's go over to Romans 7, because Paul really identifies what the core of this particular offering is about. Romans 7 and verse 21. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, or I agree with what God's law convicts us of. But I see a different law in my members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. He's saying there's something else more fundamental to who I am and what I am, and that's really eating at me. He's not talking about the things that he's doing. Earlier he does talk about, what I'm doing I don't want to do. He talks about the fruits of that. But here he's getting down to the core, not of what he does, that he does what he doesn't want to do, but he is what he doesn't want to be. He wants to be something else. Intellectually he knows, he agrees he wants to be something. But as he observes himself, as he examines himself, and he sees the things that he does, he recognizes that that's not what he is. He's this other thing. And so he says, wretched man that I am. That's the sum of it. That's what the sin offering is driving home, right? Wretched man that I am, not wretched things that I do, wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? And so he thanks God because he recognizes that freedom comes through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other with my flesh, the law of sin. He sees that in himself, here's what he is. He recognizes his nature. I think this offering, perhaps more than any of the other offerings, it's easy to see Christ's fulfillment of this offering. Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of the sin offering. And we can see that he offered himself not solely for what we did, our transgressions, as we read in Isaiah 53. Let's go back over there. Isaiah 53. He was wounded for our transgressions, it says. But let's go down to verse 10 of Isaiah 53. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. He says, when you make his soul an offering for sin, he says, he, being God, made his soul, Jesus Christ, an offering for sin. For this sinful nature that we have, for this that we are. It's through Jesus Christ that we can be delivered from this body of death that Paul talks about with its nature. And it's only through his sacrifice that we can have that. Justice, God's justice, demands our death. It demands that we die. We know I'll read you a couple scriptures you're probably familiar with. Romans 3:23. It says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We know that. You and I, we have sinned. And so, because we've sinned, we read over in Ezekiel 18, verse 20, it says, the soul that sins shall die. And it's as simple as that. There's a sin, death is required, and that's the end of the story. But through Jesus Christ, the sins in us, right, the sinful nature in us even, can be fixed. It can be changed. Right? It can be pushed down and pushed aside and replaced. And our minds can be rebuilt. And we can have atonement with God, not just over some offense that we committed, but over what we are. What we are can be overlooked while we're in this body or in this tent. And we can have all of those sins forgiven. We can have that sinful nature even forgiven, to the point that God sees us as upright while we're still even in this body. So what then are you, and what am I? When you look at yourself, when you analyze yourself, right, how do you see yourself? Because I think sometimes it can be very easy for us to see ourselves as trespassers. We can see ourselves as people who, I do this, and I do this, and I do this, and I have this problem, and I do this. And I keep doing these things. Right? And we need to see those. I'm not saying we shouldn't see those. God gave us this trespass offering specifically to call out actions against other people, things that we do that need to be corrected. We need to see the trespasses. We need to see ourselves as trespassers. But it can be easy to stop there. It can be easy to stop and say, if I could just stop doing these things, I'd be all right. Because the sin offering, when we look at what it means, it tells you, no, even if you just stopped doing those things, you wouldn't be all right. I wouldn't be all right. Because there's something more fundamental that we are. We're sinners, right? When we talk about ourselves as being sinners, as apart from trespassers, we're not talking about ourselves as people who sin all the time doing things. We're talking about ourselves as sinners, as people who are something else, who are this thing that Paul calls a wretched man, that we don't want to be. We need to see ourselves in that light and respond to that. We can recognize, we've looked then at these sacrifices, and we can recognize what these sacrifices mean and what they point out. And some of this is really fundamental, but the sacrifices give us such a vivid picture of some of these things. And they really bring to light certain aspects of Jesus Christ's sacrifice. And they're worth our time to investigate and to look at, because they help us understand a little more deeply some of these principles and some of these things that we need to change. And change is really what God is looking at. He's showing us that through Jesus Christ's sacrifice, forgiveness is possible. Atonement is possible. We can be at one with Him. But there's a response that He expects. Let's turn over to 1 Peter 2. And we'll close here. 1 Peter 2 and verse 24. Because this really gets at the response that He wants. It says, He Himself bore our sins in His body on the tree, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by His wounds you were healed. This healing is not... Sometimes we go here and we talk about physical healing, and that's part of what He offered Himself for. But in this context, it's so much fuller than that. That by His wounds you were healed. Healed, we're stitched back together. We have that atonement with God, and then subsequently with each other that we can even have. For you were continually straying like sheep. But now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. This is the reaction that he's looking for from us. This is the response that he wants from us daily, momentarily, if necessary. Right? This is the response that he wants. Because we do, again, we go astray. Right? When we're talking about unintentional sin, right? Remember that means going astray, staggering, wandering. And this is what Peter is calling out here. He says, you were continually straying like sheep. That's what we've been, and that's what we do. That's what we are. But we want it to be said of us that now we have returned to the shepherd and guardian of our souls. We need to be repenting. I hope that this has been an interesting study. Again, I think there's so much that we can learn and that we can apply from these sacrifices. Hope you have a wonderful week.